One of my favorite topics of medical history, that's 19th century. There's so much that happened during the 19th century that just transformed our profession from one we would barely recognize to one that looks very familiar today. And over the next 50 minutes or so, through perhaps a dozen or so slides, I'm going to take you through some of the major changes that occurred, but also besides just cataloging how medicine changed, I'm going to try to give you a look at how it looked at ground level when it was being experienced. So we can try to gain some wisdom or perspective from how life was lived then and how progress was made. And maybe there's something in there that we could learn for today as well. So that's where we're going to go. I ask that I welcome your questions at the end and look forward to what observations you may have at that time. But for now, let's get into it. So medicine in the 1800s, I tend to divide into two eras. And so there's before 1840 and then after 1840. And before 1840, progress in medicine was measured by centuries, not by weeks or months as we know it today. And a lot of what was being practiced was tradition. It was what was handed down. It really wasn't considered to be connected to science. Many of the theories that led to the practices that occurred dated back to Grecian times when logic prevailed and science really wasn't something that was practiced at that time. And a lot of what we saw was referred to as heroic medicine. The idea was that if you were not well, that your body in some way was not in balance. And so if you could be returned to balance, then you would be healthy again. And in analyzing the body, they looked in terms of four humors. So there was blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. And they felt that if you had too much or too little of one of those, that if they restored you to balance, you'd be okay. Into that comes other things, what season of the year it was, what your temperament was, certain excesses or the like were associated with certain temperaments. And so a history and physical in those days didn't resemble what we're used to today at all. And the treatments that were involved basically bleeding, purging, emetics, blistering. The meds that were used, a lot of metals that we know today to be poisonous, mercury or arsenic, would induce what they felt would restoring balance, so vomiting or diarrhea. And opium was available to treat pain. Doctors prepared their own medications. And so this was handed down as to how to do it. And as you can imagine, there wasn't a lot of uniformity. And it wasn't until 1808 that the Massachusetts Medical Society produced the first pharmacopoeia, basically a recipe book in an attempt to list what was out there, to list how it was made and what you could do to make it, and try to introduce some sort of standards. When it came to epidemics, the prevailing theory was miasmas, that there was a foul gas rising from rotting materials and that this was causing the spread in a certain area of disease. And there were very few tools, dental extractors, amputation instruments, and obstetric forceps starting particularly in the 1700s. And the instruments for bleeding or for blistering, that's what was in the toolkit for the doctor. Education, particularly in the United States, was primarily apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship would be 2 or 3 years. You'd work with a doctor, assist them, learn from them, and then they would perhaps give you a set of tools, a letter of recommendation, and you were in practice. There were a few medical schools, and surprisingly, the medical schools taught theory. The approach was very different from an apprenticeship, and they went over these theories about the balance of the humors and the like. You would attend 2 3-month courses of lectures and repeat exactly that 2 3-month courses of lectures a second year. In general, examinations were oral, and there was no patient contact. If you wanted that, you could get it on your own, and many motivated doctors did. But that's kind of how it went. There was no licensure. There was no board of registration in medicine in those days. And if you were admitted to the medical society, if you were a physician practicing traditional medicine, the local medical society, our Worcester district, as an example, would have censors who, when you applied, would give you an oral exam. And if you met the standards, then you were admitted to the medical society. And that was a credential that you could present to the public, but it was not required. So that's kind of how it looked. And you can imagine that if you call the doctor, you're not feeling well, and he shows up and he's going to bleed you, or he's going to purge you, or the like, you might be looking for some other alternatives. You want to get better, you want to be comforted, and you don't want to be killed. So there were plenty of people who were offering other alternatives. And to give you a flavor of what choices there were out there was homeopathy from Dr. Hahnemann in Germany, the concept that minute dilutions, one in many, many thousands dilutions of substances that may be related to the complaint that you have would in some way build up a resistance in your body, and you would be able to fight off the disease. So that was a theory. It probably didn't do much harm, and so it had its proponents. And indeed, homeopathy is practiced even today. Water cures, another one where just a purification ritual of sorts. They would bathe you. You might get steam, and then you would drink a lot of water to cleanse you out. Water enemas, the like. All of these ideas, again, towards trying to get the toxins out of your system. Mesmerism, Dr. Mesmer from France, the power of the mind, the power of hypnosis to try to convince people that they could overcome their illness. Thomsonianism from Dr. Thompson in New Hampshire, based primarily on botanicals, and again, focusing on gastrointestinal complaints a little bit more. That also was fairly popular, particularly in the early 19th century. And then electric treatments, with the development of electricity, what's not to like there? If you got a headache or some muscle spasm, then there you are. You could give that a try and see if that took you where you wanted to be. And if we look at sickness and death in the early 1800s, know that the average lifespan was about 40, in the 40s. And a lot of this was colored by the fact that childbirth was a major contributor to mortality. And so about 1 in 7 babies died before their first birthday. And about 1 in 100 women, or even more, died in childbirth, most of the time because of a condition called childbed fever. So that markedly decreased the average lifespan right there. The only vaccine available was for smallpox. It was effective, but it was not widely distributed the way it was in the 20th century. There were no knowledge at that point in time of infections, no knowledge of hygiene and the like. And the illnesses that were suffered were mostly infections, trauma, particularly with the industrial age. And so those were the big things that led to illness as well as to death. Chronic illnesses such as diabetes or hypertension weren't identified. Nobody was measuring blood pressure. Nobody was measuring sugar levels. And people weren't living into old age that often anyway. And ditto with cancer. Again, there weren't that many people living into old age. And so it was there, but it didn't play a major role in the morbidity or mortality. So into this, we go to the second era, after 1840, when things really start to change. And one of the things I really appreciate about history is that there are times when an idea has its moment. And so you may find that the same idea pops up in more than one place at about the same time. And so it is in the 1840s with Oliver Wendell Holmes in Boston and Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna regarding childbed fever, a condition which we now would identify as an infection in the uterus, endometritis. And both of them came to the conclusion that there was some particle, some material that the doctor, the person doing the delivery, was carrying with them. And that if you were to cleanse your hands, if you were in some way to decrease the chance of carrying mysterious particle along, that you might be able to cut down the risks of infection. So that was a major breakthrough that occurred in the 1840s. Also in the 1840s, Horace Wells in Hartford with nitrous oxide, Crawford Long in Georgia, Morton in Boston, and James Young Simpson in Edinburgh, all about this within a couple of years of each other. That widespread, came to the conclusion that there were chemicals which, if you inhaled them, they would render you senseless, and they would eventually wear off, and you would wake up and be okay. And so the notion of anesthesia came into play and revolutionized the practice of surgery, so that the main qualification of a surgeon prior to anesthesia was speed. You would have four strong men holding someone down. They would perform an amputation in less than a minute. And the mortality and morbidity from that was astronomical. With the advent of anesthesia, they could take their time. The patient was not going through this horrible experience. And indeed, even the scope of anesthesia could change, so that you could offer, of surgery rather, so that you could offer surgery in the abdomen, for example, which would not be something that you'd want to do prior to the anesthesia. In the 1850s, both in England, Florence Nightingale and John Snow came to the conclusion that good hygiene would prevent illness, would improve health, would improve the chance of recovery. So clean air, clean water, clean environs, that concept was introduced, and interestingly introduced independent of the germ theory. It was something that was felt to be a virtue in and of itself. And in the 1860s and 70s, Pasteur in France, Koch in Germany, and Lister in Edinburgh identified bacteria as something which could cause infection in man. And Lister systematized it so that he could go to aseptic surgery, is what he proclaimed, and markedly decrease the mortality rate from surgery. And the woodcut you see here is a woodcut of Lister doing his work. Note, he would have cleaned his hands, and all of his assistants would have cleaned their hands with carbolic acid, a chemical which he chose because it was used to essentially deodorize things that were considered to be unhealthy. And so he thought maybe that would be good to wash their hands with as well. So he launched into using that to clean his hands. He cleaned the abdomen. He had a mister in the OR that was putting carbolic acid mist into the air. And then after the surgery, he wrapped the patient's bandages after they were soaked in carbolic acid. So that was his approach. He was greeted with remarkable success. And note also, you don't see any masks there. You don't see any IV there. You don't see any gloves there. All of those things were many decades off, and the benefits of this approach to surgery were realized, but the results were improved even more with these other developments. So let's just pause at this point and take a look at how these discoveries and their implementation and acceptance occurred. And let's start with Oliver Wendell Holmes. A young physician at that time, as you can see from the photograph, in 1843, he's a member of the Boston Society for Medical Improvement. And they are discussing their cases. They meet every few weeks. And he notes that there are a lot of cases of childbed fever, a lot of women dying of childbed fever. This gets his attention. He's actually not had a case of childbed fever himself, but his seniors there suggest that he investigate this a little bit more, that he report back to them his findings so that they can learn a little more with him. And he does so. He looks at the cases, he reads whatever is written in the textbooks or literature, and he forms an opinion. Basically, his key observation was that doctors who had one case of childbed fever tended to have more. And that being in the proximity of someone with childbed fever, so their next door neighbors, if they delivered someone else in the neighborhood, that kind of thing, didn't seem to raise the risk. The key factor here seemed to be the doctor who was moving from one patient to another. And he wrote this up. he submitted it to a New England journal. It's not the New England Journal that we know about today, but was a fairly new journal at the time. They had very little circulation and they only survived a year. And it was published there. He waited for things to change. Nothing did. He figured nobody was reading his article. So at his own expense, he paid to have his findings published. He sent them to the most prominent obstetricians in the country and really urged them, told them how important it was. And he sent it right to the leaders. He told them that, in his opinion, people should step back from deliveries if they have a case of childbed fever. They should perhaps change their clothes. He wasn't exactly sure what they needed to do, but he had several recommendations. And he punctuated that by saying that really, if you don't follow these things, and you've heard what I've got to say, you've seen my observations, you know how logical this is, that you are really costing women their lives. Well, one of these prominent obstetricians was Charles Meigs. He was the most prominent obstetrician in the country. He was based in Philadelphia, and he referred to Holmes's challenge as the jejune and physicalist dreaming of a sophomore, with thundering forth denunciations, and would mark with a black spot the reputation of every physician who, in the province of God, is called upon to contend with this rage. So he wasn't taking it too well. I would never convict myself of being the means of spreading a contagion. Doctors are gentlemen, and gentlemen have clean hands. After about a decade of this back and forth with the heat really getting hotter, he finally backs off a little bit and says that he probably doesn't see much harm in following these theories. He doesn't quite believe them himself, but he's not going to get mad at anybody if they follow him. But this is the exchange that's going on while Holmes is trying to make his point. Now, meanwhile, we go to Vienna, and Ignaz Semmelweis, born in Budapest, educated in Vienna, graduates from medical school, and medical schools were more common in Vienna than they were in the United States for doctors. And he is hired, he's brought onto the staff of the Vienna General Hospital. And they have a very large obstetric unit. In those days, women delivered at home in the United States as well as in Vienna. But if you were poor, if you were going to deliver on the street, then the charitable hospital, the Vienna General Hospital, would provide you with a place to deliver your baby. And indeed, you were less likely to leave behind a foundling, an abandoned child. So the women would come here for delivery. And there were two services. There was a midwife service stocked with midwives who were focusing on doing their deliveries. And there was a physician service in which they were training physicians, they were learning new things. And as part of the tradition there, in addition to delivering care, if a woman died on their service, the standard at that time was to do a postmortem. So into this comes Ignaz Semmelweis. He's new to the whole thing, and he's just captivated by this idea of childbed fever and the fact that women are dying of this. The rate was a little bit higher than on the doctor's side than the midwife's side, and that bothered him even more. So he starts looking into this and becomes very meticulous about doing postmortems on women who die. And the more postmortems he does, the higher the rate goes. He is not finding a cause, and not only that, but the problem is getting worse around him as this is happening. It goes from 1.5% or 2% at that point up to a high of 20%. And he is just unraveling. His colleagues say, why don't you back away, take a little vacation, come back refreshed? And he takes their advice. He leaves for a while. The service is taken over by the other doctors there. They're not nearly as obsessive as he is. Not too many postmortems get done, and the rate starts to come down. When he returns, he finds that he's greeted by a department that has a lower rate of death than before, which really perplexes him. But the other thing he finds is that one of his colleagues, who is performing a postmortem, cuts his finger and eventually becomes ill, dies, and he participates in the postmortem on his colleague. When he looks at the abdominal cavity, he finds findings that he's familiar with because they are similar to what he has seen so many times with childbed fever. And he draws the conclusion that there is something moving from someone who has childbed fever and being carried by the doctor, some particle that is transmitting this disease. And so his insight is that they need to prevent that from happening, and they could be taking it from the postmortem uh, uh, station to the birth chamber. And so he wants to prevent that. And he promotes the use of carbolic acid to wash hands, a chemical, again, as I might have mentioned earlier, that's used in cleaning foul refuse and the like, cleaning up rooms. And so he's washing his hands with the carbolic acid. And he actually runs a trial, which is not the standard at that time and really is a little bit revolutionary. And he introduces the idea of washing your hands between patients after postmortems. And what he finds is that the rate goes down. So he was running a very high rate. It goes right down. So he introduces this trial. He finds that the rate goes down quite a bit. And he has managed to mandate this among his trainees, but now he's in the position of trying to convince his colleagues. And he's not running into much success there at all either. Similar to Oliver Wendell Holmes, he's being dismissed. They don't buy into his theory. They're not willing to start washing their hands. And he just unravels. He is standing there accusing them of killing women, and it doesn't go over well at all. And so he has a 2-year contract when he was originally hired. His supervisor is getting a little tired of him, so he doesn't renew his contract, and he's out. He's back in Budapest. The Ignaz Semmelweis story gets even worse after that. I won't cover it, but suffice it to say that it wasn't smooth sailing with regard to his discovery. Now, we've got Joseph Lister next in Edinburgh, and he read Pasteur's work in the 1860s and concluded Pasteur was looking for what was dealing with fermentation and discovering these bacteria. And he thought that what Pasteur was describing was likely also related to the putrefaction he's seeing in so many patients. And he knew that carbolic acid was successful in deodorizing refuse. No evidence that he was in any way aware of what Semmelweis had done 20 plus years later, or before rather. But nonetheless, they both chose carbolic acid. And so he implemented it, as I shown you in that woodcut a couple slides ago. And he cut his surgical mortality down from 50%, which is a horrifying number, down to 15%, which is still a horrifying number, but it's a whole lot better. And so he was convinced that this made a huge difference. Again, he's the young guy. He's got a new idea. It conflicts with everybody else. And the doctors in his hospital reject his ideas. He persists. Eventually, he's frustrated. He leaves Edinburgh and goes to London. He's, by this point, getting a little older, moving up the totem pole a little bit. Eventually, people buy into his ideas. And in fact, his approach is accepted in England. It's accepted in Europe. He gains an international reputation and indeed is invited to present at the Centennial Exposition in the United States in 1876. There he goes. He presents his theories. He presents his findings to the most prominent physicians in the United States, and they dismiss it out of hand. They refer to bacteria as animalcules. If we were to believe what he's saying, these little animalcules would be floating around in the air. That, of course, is nonsense. And they didn't buy into his theory at all at that time. That's relevant to where we go next. Now, I'm going to go into 3 different characters for you right now and paint a picture of them. First is James Garfield, which you, I'm sure, know was a president. He was the 20th president of the United States. And most of us don't know much about him at all. And that's too bad. I can tell you that the more I learned about him, the more I admired him. raised in poverty in northeastern Ohio on a farm. His father died when he was 4, just abject poverty, barefoot, dirt floor kind of thing. But his mother knew the value of education. She knew that if you were going to advance in this life, you needed an education. And although she had several children, and James was not her oldest, she saw in James a talent and an intelligence that she put all of her hope into. And so in addition to struggling to raise the family, she was doing her best to put aside some additional money so that James could get a better education. And indeed, even his older brother felt the same way and worked hard so they could put James into college. And he enrolls in Western Reserve, northeastern Ohio, and basically is trying to pay his bills by being a janitor, taking as many courses as he possibly can. In very short order, they recognize what they've got on their hands. And by the end of his first year, he is an assistant professor. He moves from there to Williams College in Massachusetts, which then is now has a very good reputation, and basically looks at his class and said, you know, these people are very bright, but I'm going to finish at the top of this class, and works hard, is successful, does finish at the top of his class, and when he graduates, goes back to Western Reserve to be a teacher or a professor there. Into this, 1860 occurs, the Civil War breaks out, and he volunteers for the Civil War, goes in as a colonel, and through some very clever strategy with some battles, he's a general by the end of the Civil War. While he is gone, an opening occurs, and in the Senate or in the House of Representatives of the United States, and he is run by his friends to become a congressman. So he's almost done in absentia while he's in the service. He's elected, and as a result of this, he doesn't want to leave his troops. He wants to stay with them, and it's only a direct appeal from Abraham Lincoln that he is needed in Washington that he finally leaves and goes to Washington. So he's a successful legislator in Washington when the election of 1880 comes up. And at that point, the Republican Party was in disarray. The whole issue of the spoils system, the patronage system, is being challenged. And there are the stalwarts who are supporters of this spoils system. There are the half-breeds in the Republican Party who want to go more on merit than on connection. And there are a lot of fights going on. He is sent to the convention to give a nominating speech for one of his colleagues from Ohio, who is one of the new people, one of the half-breeds. And he gives the speech. Basically, what happens is it's a convention in which no one is thrilled with any of their choices, and they listen to him speak, and he gets their attention, not because he's convinced them to vote for his man, but because they're impressed with him. When the ballots start to go, basically, there's a lot of back and forth. Days go by. They're into the 30s with regard to ballots, and nobody is getting the requisite number of votes to be a nominee. Eventually, somebody puts forward his name. He objects, saying, "You can't nominate me if I don't agree to it." The chair of the convention rules him out of order, and he becomes their candidate. His response to the press after this was, "I'm just so sorry it came to this." But nonetheless, he runs in a very close election. He is elected. We know how that goes. And in March of 1881, he is sworn in as President of the United States. That is the situation with him. Now, Charles Guiteau is someone who had failed at just about everything that he had tried. He also had a very difficult childhood. His mother died when he was very young. His father felt to be a bit of a religious fanatic. But Guiteau himself started to show some signs of delusions of grandeur, of mental illness early on. And He had tried law, he had tried ministry, he joined a free love commune and was expelled. He had been thrown into jail for not paying bills. He managed to marry this woman who eventually left him after some abuse. And his family tried to have him institutionalized, but he got away before they could accomplish that. So that's the context of Guiteau that we see here. But in his own mind, he was a man of great distinction and promise, and he predicted a glorious future for himself. So in those days, office seekers would head towards Washington when a new president was elected, and so he headed towards Washington when Garfield was elected. He, after considering all the possible offices that he might seek, he settled on being ambassador in Paris and set about trying to convince them to put him in that position. People would go directly to the top. Essentially, they would go to the White House, seeking an audience with the president or with his Secretary of State, in this case, James Blaine. And Guiteau was essentially going there daily, trying to convince them to hire them. After a while, Blaine said to him that you're not going to get that job, and you don't need to come back anymore. So this is probably the end of May, and he's licking his wounds a little bit. Sends off a letter to Garfield saying, you really ought to look at that Blaine. I don't think he's doing you any favors, and you might consider getting rid of him. But that's about it. One morning in early June, Guiteau wakes up and feels that he has been contacted by God, and God has said, if you remove Garfield from office, that the world will be a better place. The stalwarts will come back into power. You'll be more likely to get a job. People will view you as a hero. Even he thought that was a fairly radical thing for God to be asking him to do. He waited a few weeks to see if things changed. The dream stayed with him. And so in June, he borrowed $10 from a friend, told him that he was going to use it to pay rent, went to the store, bought a gun, some bullets, and began practicing. Willard Bliss was a prosperous and prominent physician in Washington, D.C. He found himself in trouble at one point. He had supported the idea of blacks being admitted to the medical society. He had supported the idea that homeopathy may not be as bad as traditional doctors were making it out to be. And both of those things got him thrown out of the medical society. He thought he could tough it out. He thought he could just go by his reputation alone. That didn't work out. And after a while, he basically tried to garner as much support as he could. In fact, at one point, even getting a letter of support from then Congressman Garfield, and was readmitted to the Washington Medical Society, renouncing his previous things, vowing essentially to practice nothing but the most straightforward medicine and to follow the straight and narrow. With this, he is greeted with success again, and again is prosperous. So this is the context into which on July 2nd, 1881, Garfield plans on going up into New Jersey and stopping there for a bit of a vacation on his way to Williams College to give a talk at his alma mater. He's looking for a bit of a rest as well. The fact that he is leaving is in the local papers, so people know. And Guiteau is aware of this. He has been essentially following the president for a few weeks, looking for his moment, and he's decided that this is the moment. He arrives at the train station early, has his shoes shined, has a letter in his pocket explaining why he's killed the president and asking people to send the military to release him so that he can be greeted as a hero. And he is there waiting when Garfield comes in, accompanied by Blaine, his Secretary of State, and Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's son, who was the Secretary of War. Guiteau walks up behind Garfield, shoots him in the arm. Garfield is startled and twists. Another bullet goes in under his left rib on the right, and blood spurts out. Garfield vomits, collapses to the floor, writhing in pain. Guiteau, even though he expected to be caught, takes off and is apprehended rather quickly. And Garfield on the floor is bleeding. People don't know what to do. They call for doctors. Within an hour, 10 doctors have come in. All are focusing on that bullet wound. All are figuring that if they get their finger on that bullet and get it out, that everything would be well. And so he's examined by about 10 doctors, initially right on the floor in the railroad station. Then they take him upstairs to a more private area. Into all of this chaos, Robert Todd Lincoln remembers that Willard Bliss had been comforting to the family when his father was assassinated, and that he was a reputable physician, and he has Bliss called for. Bliss arrives, takes control of the moment, and again begins probing, initially with instruments, then with his bare finger, trying to find that bullet. He also dismisses the other doctors, including one Charles Purvis, who was a black surgeon and who had come there and was watching this. And when he saw what Bliss was doing, beseeched him not to probe anymore, to please just bandage the wound and essentially follow the guidelines that Lister would have. He was ignored by Bliss, who did not even acknowledge he was there. Eventually, they move Garfield to the White House. He is put in a room. Bliss essentially takes control of the situation, controls all communication, controls all visitors. A number of younger physicians, again, express the idea that probing the wound is not a good idea, and are dismissed as juniors, sophomores, to use the phrase we used earlier. And what then happens is that pus starts to come from the wound. Garfield is running fevers and chills. He's deteriorating. Bliss calls in some senior surgeons, all of whom approve of what he's doing. They insert drains, more pus comes out. He's having trouble eating, he's vomiting everything. They're doing rectal feeds. His weight drops from 210 pounds down to 130 pounds. And this unfolds over a couple of months. During the time, the world and the country are just utterly focused on this. And what we see is the press in this cut here being advised as to the president's condition regularly. And you can see the audience is very great. You can also see a number of doctors gathered around Garfield's bed, and off to the corner there is Alexander Graham Bell, who, following all of this news, wants to help. And he knows they're focusing on finding that bullet. He also knows that after the telephone, he's working on this coil device that works as a metal detector, and he thinks he can be of help. So he offers his assistance. He comes down to Washington from Boston, discusses things with Bliss, and eventually Bliss agrees to try the instrument. And what you see here is Bliss essentially scanning the president's abdomen while Bell is off to the side, listening for a click from the metal. And the long and short of it is they didn't find the bullet. There are a number of things that play into that, but perhaps the most significant is the fact that Bliss was so convinced that the bullet was right under where it entered his right side that he would not even scan the left side. He only scanned the right side. So all of this attention, all of this is going in, and eventually Garfield is coming to the conclusion that he is not going to survive this. He is requesting that he be taken up to the Jersey Shore, that he get to see the ocean, to rest, to be in a more peaceful environment. Bliss resists initially, and Garfield is insistent. So Bliss takes control of the transport. They have a special train. They get all other trains off the tracks. No one's allowed to even toot their horn. They build tracks from the railroad station in New Jersey up to the house he's going to, so that he can have a very direct shot at being delivered to this house as gently as possible. And along the train route, thousands of people gather just to silently watch this car go by. He gets up to the train station. These new tracks apparently go up a rise that is a little bit more than the locomotive can tolerate. And so they're not able to get past the rise. 200 men silently come forward and essentially manually push the cart up to the house, where he is brought into the house. The condition does not improve, needless to say. By now we're out over 2 months, and the drains are getting worse. He's getting disseminated pustules around his body. He's got a large infection in his salivary gland, high fevers, continual vomiting and pain. And at 10 o'clock on September 19th, 1881, Garfield suddenly cries out in pain and then dies. Lucretia, his wife, is sitting there with his body for over an hour, and until one of her caretakers just begs her to retire. Taking his hand, and without a word, she leaves the room. The next day, a postmortem is performed by an Army physician. They spend 4 hours doing a very detailed postmortem. And what they find is what you see on the left-hand side of the screen here. The bullet, as it entered Garfield's right side, had turned and was essentially lodged behind his pancreas, walled off in connective tissue, not bothering anybody. There were huge abscesses, the huge abscess that was getting probed by the doctors repeatedly, but other abscesses around his body. Both lungs were involved, and that was what was found, in addition to the fact that one of the abscesses eroded into a vessel, and the terminal event was actually an internal hemorrhage. The pathologist turned to the other doctors who were there, including Bliss, and said just quietly, "We were wrong," and walks out of the room. Bliss, however, maintains that he has provided state-of-the-art care, that no one could have done better than him. And he refused to, not only did he refuse to admit an error, he sent a bill for $25,000 to the government for his services. They, after debating it back and forth, offered him $6,500. He let them know that he was insulted and refused to accept it. Basically, his reputation was awful. His practice was gone, and he died 7 years later. Guiteau was entered a plea of insanity. He said that he was not responsible for the president's death, that God had told him to do it. He was simply carrying out orders. He also points out the fact that although he tried to kill the president, he didn't. And that the people who killed the president were the president's doctors, and they were the ones who should be held responsible. Nonetheless, passions were very, very high throughout the entire country. Lynch mobs were forming. People were taking shots at him as he was going back and forth between the prison and the court. Even his own guard took a shot at him at one point. And so you can imagine the atmosphere in which this was taking place. A local paper said Guiteau should have a fair trial. Everything that can be urged in his behalf should be patiently heard. It is the right of the meanest thing that bears the human form. But such a trial, such a hearing, in a community of intelligent people can only have one result. They had to screen 175 potential jurors to sit a jury. The trial lasted over 2 months, involved experts on the insanity plea back and forth. However, when the case was rested, the jury returned a guilty verdict in less than an hour. And Guiteau was hanged on June 30th, 1882, 2 days before the 1-year anniversary of the shooting. You should note that there was some enthusiasm for his hanging. 20,000 people requested tickets so they could come in and watch. And what you see in the lower right-hand corner there is one of those tickets. Only 250 tickets were issued. But nonetheless, the feelings were very high regarding having him hung for what he did. So there we are. That's the ground level. That's how progress looks when it's happening. And so let's look at a couple of other things. One is, what on earth were those doctors thinking? I mean, we look at this in horror today because we know better. But they had a theory, miasmas, that explained what was happening. They didn't need that other theory with them. The use of carbolic acid was actually very irritating. And so if you didn't believe it and there was this irritating thing they were asking you to do, why bother? Most patients did okay without hand washing, particularly in a time when nobody was much keeping statistics of their outcomes. Most of your cases were doing fine. 98 out of 100 women basically didn't die from childbirth. And so in their minds, things were working out well. The consequences of no hand washing were instantaneous. The bad stuff happened days or weeks later. And in the interim, a lot of things could have happened, which could have explained what was happening. And some got infected even with hand washing. So, when we look at Lister's results where he cut his surgical mortality rate from 50% to 15%, it's still 15% were dying when he did that. That is still a very large number. And indeed, when we look at Meigs and the jejune and physalis thing that he said, we need to know that that was coming with the experience that he had a colleague who had a number of cases of childbed fever and who had left town for 10 days, 2 weeks or so, and returned to town, was called to a delivery, took a bath, wore new clothes, had his head shaved, put on a new wig, left his watch and pen at home. So really, he was checking off all the boxes that Oliver Wendell Holmes said he should check off. And he went and did his delivery, and the woman developed childbed fever and died. So he was not speaking just with regard to rejecting the idea, but he had this story in his mind as well. And people were on the defensive. They were being accused of killing people. And it's not just a matter of the reflexive defensiveness, but Semmelweis had a colleague who believed what he was saying, who thought the theory was a very sensible theory. However, before the proposal to change what they were doing and to use the carbolic acid washes at the Vienna General Hospital, he had delivered his niece. And his niece developed childbed fever and died. And so in knowing that he may well have caused his niece's death, he committed suicide. So the defensiveness piece is something that we can't ignore, that we need to understand. And change was being recommended by outsiders, by inferiors, the people on the young side of the career scale, and those of us who are physicians know how that goes. So in summary, what can we say? Well, first of all, the 19th century saw medicine change from something that was very primitive, no evidence-based, to one in which there were major discoveries, major transition in many things, not just those things that I just presented to you today. But progress was anything but linear. Human nature, then as now, plays a role. And we trust people who are members of our tribe, not so much for people who are not members of our tribe. Passion and confrontation come with significant drawbacks, and defending oneself becomes a priority. So in summary, I have to say that the message and the messenger need to be tailored to the recipient. So I thank you for your time. If you're interested in other references, The Doctor's Plague by Sherwin Newland, Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard, which is the one on Garfield and is spectacular. Stalking the Doctors of the Full Moon by Sandy Bishop, about a group of physicians in the early 1800s in southern Worcester County. High Conflict by Amanda Ripley, I think, is great reading. And I also want to thank Reed Roberts, my colleague. This talk looked a little different when he attended it and had nothing to do with Garfield at all. And he came up to me afterwards and said, "You really want to read this book." In fact, he actually went to the point of bringing me the book, and I did read it. And so it was with that idea that I've gone with this. So there we are. Thank you for your time. And if